To some, the horror and carnage inflicted on the United States today is a cause of celebration. This was the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, where many showed their approval of a day of unprecedented terror in America's backyard. A claim of responsibility was reported from one Palestinian group, but then swiftly denied. The Palestinian leader condemned the attacks.
We are completely shocked, completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Investigators hunting the organisers will first consider these were airborne suicide missions on a scale not seen since the Second World War.
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
And it's this wealthy Arab fundamentalist that American officials are already naming as an immediate suspect, Osama bin Laden. He controls and finances Al-Qaeda, an umbrella network of Islamic militants, and he's vowed to destroy the United States. Bin Laden is accused of masterminding a string of attacks, including the US embassy bombings in East Africa 3 years ago, which killed more than 200 people. In retaliation, the Americans fired cruise missiles at training camps used by bin Laden in Afghanistan. They put a $5 million price on his head and led a worldwide crackdown on Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan's ruling Taliban, which continues to offer bin Laden sanctuary, insists he isn't capable of carrying out attacks like today's. But bin Laden is suspected of involvement in the last attack on the World Trade Center 8 years ago. 6 people died when a bomb exploded in an underground car park. His associate, Ramzi Youssef, was jailed for that, and for plotting to blow up a dozen American airliners over the Pacific, a plan which in some respects foreshadowed today's terror. While the possibility isn't being excluded, no one's suggesting that the devastation of such high-profile international targets like the Pentagon and the World Trade Center is domestic terrorism. The sophistication of today's attacks, with highly trained perpetrators and their synchronization to occur within 2 hours, point towards months, if not years, of preparation. Does all this mean then that a rogue state might be involved? Some experts are skeptical.
Countries have realized that as governments, their involvement in terrorism has cost them more than it's gained them. And so there are very few countries left who are in the real terrorism business. Obviously, some governments fund groups that may conduct terrorist acts, but that's very different than actually providing government support for it.
State condolences flood in, yet it seems highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the biggest and bloodiest terrorist operation ever could have been planned and prepared without a single government around the world even noticing. George Eakin, BBC News.
And some news just in from Pakistan, where a newspaper used by the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden has published a statement in which Mr. bin Laden has denied involvement in the American attacks. However, the Afghanistan-based Islamist said he fully supported the attacks. Well, President Bush promised to find those responsible and bring them to justice. Bill Hayton looks at his options.
The wreckage at the Pentagon is still being cleared and the human cost still being counted. The horror inflicted on bases and embassies around the world over the past 2 decades has now hit America's highest military headquarters. The sheer might controlled from this building has made direct military attacks against the United States all but impossible. Instead, its enemies have turned to so-called asymmetric warfare, small-scale operations with dramatic effects, such as last year's bomb attack in Yemen against the USS Cole.
And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes, and I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime, but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship.
Washington has responded with court action against those it believes responsible, but also with direct military retaliation.
And I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
When Osama bin Laden's group bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 3 years ago, killing more than 220 people, the response was dramatic. More than 80 cruise missiles were fired at sites in Afghanistan and Sudan, allegedly connected to his organization. They killed 20 people, but missed bin Laden himself. The actual bombers were extradited to the US, and last May, 4 men were convicted in New York and sentenced to life in jail. But retaliation doesn't always hit the right targets. In 1986, after 2 American soldiers were blown up in a Berlin nightclub, US planes bombed Libya, though it was later suggested that Syrian agents had been responsible. And Washington is being sued for millions of dollars by a businessman whose Sudanese factory was destroyed by a cruise missile after it was wrongly linked to bin Laden.
If they reflect on these questions and if they look at the source of the resentment in the Arab world and Muslim world, I believe there wouldn't be any attack. But sending cruise missile, it wouldn't solve the problem. It will maybe fuel more problems to the American and to the whole international community.
The USS Enterprise is sailing to join another carrier group in the Gulf, projecting American power into the heart of the Middle East. But political leaders must now decide whether using that power makes further attacks more or less likely in the future. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
The events have been described as America's second Pearl Harbor. Such was the disbelief and horror at the terrorist attacks. Let's take a look back at some of the images and reactions from eyewitnesses.
I was close to the window. It was unbelievable.
I'm coming down 6th Avenue. All the people traffic was running up. And I'm looking up, I'm trying to call the station, trying to find where we are. And I look up and the tower just starts crumbling down. And everybody in the street just stops and started crying and bawling. And I'm standing next to a fireman, he said, yeah, they just bombed the Pentagon too.
Yes, I was in the traffic on the 14th Street Bridge, right at the Pentagon, tied up going into town. And I heard this plane come over my head. It was really low.
What size plane?
It sounded like a small plane, but it was very, very low. And the next thing I know, there was this tremendous explosion as it hit the Pentagon. I looked over, and the smoke started coming up. Pieces of the plane and pieces of the Pentagon were falling onto the 14th Street, onto the Shirley Highway.
It was terrible. It was terrible. A tragic day today.
This is BBC World.
I'm Martine Dennis.
And I'm Bill Turnbull.
You're watching a World Today special from BBC News. Thousands are feared dead after 2 hijacked planes slammed into the World Trade Center.
President Bush vows responsible to hunt down those behind the attacks.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Hundreds of firefighters and police officers are also buried in the rubble.
World leaders react with shock and outrage at the attacks on the Pentagon in Washington and in New York.
Welcome to the World Today special. We'll be bringing you news and analysis on the shocking events which have taken place in America. Well, it's the worst terrorist attack the United States has ever seen. Thousands of people killed in a series of strikes at the heart of American power in New York and in Washington. Governments around the world have put their defense forces on alert and called emergency security meetings. In New York, rescue workers searching under the rubble of the collapsed Twin Towers of the World Trade Center say some survivors have been found. More than 100 people have been confirmed dead in the attack on the Pentagon alone. The attack started in New York at 9:15 Tuesday morning Eastern Time. The World Trade Center's North Tower hit by a hijacked airliner with dozens of passengers on board. 18 minutes later, a second attack. Another hijacked jet slammed into the Trade Center's South Tower with precision accuracy. Next, the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. A third hijacked American airliner, again with dozens of passengers on board, flew straight into the side of the complex. As panic hit the streets, all airports across America were shut down. New York's stock exchange was suspended and the White House was evacuated. As the whole world watched on, the South Tower of the World Trade Center, the world's fourth tallest building, collapsed, followed minutes later by the center's second tower. The building, symbol of global trade and workplace for 50,000 people, reduced to rubble. A fourth hijacked plane crashed later in Pennsylvania. 45 people were on board. There were no survivors.
It should have been a perfect day. But just before 9 o'clock, the pure blue sky over Manhattan was filling with smoke. A hijacked American airliner had just smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. No one quite knew what had happened. Surely this must have been a terrible accident. But what happened next showed these were no accidents. A second hijacked airliner, a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board, is flying straight for the other tower. No one yet knows who piloted these planes to destruction, but they could not have been targeted with greater accuracy. The extraordinary impact of the second plane, the 767, was witnessed by many who simply didn't realize the full enormity of what was happening. Nor could they know the implications of a huge airliner laden with aviation fuel exploding deep inside one of the world's tallest buildings. They certainly didn't realize the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were now completely doomed.
Wow, do you see this aircraft? That's got it all.
By now, many hundreds of people must already have been dead, and the unfolding disaster could be seen all around New York.
There's another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh my God! Oh, Jesus! Oh my God! My own eyes. I just went. It must be a car. Oh my God! Another plane just went in.
At that time, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center, many thousands more in the Wall Street financial district all around. Those who could were running for their lives.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the South Tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
But it wasn't only New York and America's financial heart which was under attack. Now it was the nation's capital, too. In Washington, the Pentagon was hit, headquarters for the armed forces of the world's superpower. A third hijacked airliner, again with dozens on board, had been crashed with devastating results. By now, smoke was billowing around Capitol Hill, and the White House was being evacuated. People were talking of a new Pearl Harbor, someone declaring war on the United States. And back in New York, the nightmare was still far from over. Firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above was safe. The unthinkable was about to happen. The South Tower, all 110 stories, collapsed. And it was all live on American television.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
Do not go down on the ground. You will get trapped. You will get trapped. Don't go.
Big boom. Come down the steps. Everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy. Crawled out. Kept getting hit in the head. Had bags sold around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. You did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
The total number of casualties is not yet known, but there were 266 people on board the 4 hijacked airliners, and everyone on those flights died. Some 200 firefighters and about 100 police officers are estimated to have perished in the collapses of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. At least 100 are believed to have died in the Pentagon explosion, and there would have been thousands working in the World Trade Center, but there are no figures for just how many were trapped inside. The mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani, has advised the public to take care about leaving their homes.
If it's important and it's critical, then you come to work. But if you can stay home tomorrow, you're going to make things easier on yourself and easier on the city if you stay home. So the city is not officially closed. Manhattan is not officially closed north of 14th Street. But we're advising people if you can stay home, it would be better. Outside of Manhattan, you go to work and do all the things you would normally do. There's no particular reason to be constricted in activities there. But if you can stay out of the city, that would be good.
Live to New York now, we can join Patrick O'Connell, our correspondent there. Patrick, night has fallen in New York. Has the full horror, has the enormity of this awful tragedy sunk in?
No, I don't think it has. The events of yesterday were terrifying. In many respects, I think what's more terrifying lies ahead. If you take a look behind me down here, this is where the World Trade Center was. And it's under this rubble that are lying injured people we know, and of course dead people whose numbers we don't know. And this is what's going to be coming out in the next few hours. Horrifying details of people's lives. All over this city are people who can't reach people. They're confused. They've been trying all day. And the details will be emerging as a result of the work that's going on now.
So those search and rescue efforts, Paddy, are obviously continuing. They must be hampered, surely, by the fear that what remains of those buildings are still very, very unstable and are likely to tumble down.
That is definitely what's happened. It was hampered in the early hours, and it's being hampered now, but it is not being halted. The work is going on, but you'll know from the collapse of the third building and the evacuation of the lower part of Manhattan that the risk of unstable structures, of secondary explosions and fires has remained and still remains. The mayor has told the city that the work will go on but has been hampered, and that's exactly what's happened. You have to remember that there are many firefighters and police officers who've lost their lives because they arrived on the scene and events enfolded and engulfed them too. So there is the maximum caution given that that loss of life happened after the incident first began what seems like a very long time ago.
Patrick, there are some encouraging reports, aren't there, of life being in the basement of the World Trade Center in one or both of those buildings?
These are reports that I have not heard, and I'm afraid to tell you that much of the attention is focusing on the loss of life. As the emergency services get closer, we will hopefully find stories of people who are surviving there now and who will be rescued and recovered. But unfortunately, it's the overwhelming nature of the loss of life which is gripping most New Yorkers, quite apart from the international questions of politics and of international responses which are being talked about in many other parts of the world.
Finally, Patrick, we've just seen Mayor Giuliani giving the impression of life continuing as normal. Presumably this is an attempt to shore up people's sensibilities, to try to establish that nobody has really been completely and utterly wrecked by this and that life will continue, obviously with a certain amount of difference. North of 14th Street is open for business.
Well, it's very reduced business. People whose job is not essential are being urged not to come to work. Schools are closed. Airports are closed. The stock exchanges are closed. It's a very, very different New York. The skyline's scarred, and so has the way of life been. The mayor has said the city will rebuild, but it seems to me right now the job is finding people who are still alive.
Patrick, thank you for that update.
Rescue efforts are continuing in Washington, where a third airliner was flown into the headquarters of the American military, the Pentagon. The building burst into flames and part of its five-sided structure collapsed. It continues to burn. All those on board the plane were killed. It's not known how many casualties there were on the ground.
The end of the day that shook America and the world. After crisscrossing the country for security reasons, President Bush finally returned to Washington with a promise to hunt down those behind the attacks and with reassurance for a troubled nation.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation.
Even as the president was speaking, emergency crews continued searching through the carnage at the Pentagon just a short distance away. It was the first ever attack on the symbol of America's military might, the anger there palpable.
I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
The attacks had brought the government to a dramatic halt. Congressmen fleeing Capitol Hill for fear of further assaults, but they came back.
One thing that happens here in this place is when American suffers and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together.
As the congressman turned to leave, there was even what appeared to be a spontaneous outbreak of patriotism. Too little too late for some, perhaps. Security in the Capitol has now been increased. There are sharpshooters at the White House, more police on the streets, and new safety measures promised nationwide.
Travelers will indeed see increased security measures at our airports, train stations, and other key sites. There will be higher levels of surveillance, more stringent searches. Airport curbside luggage check-in will no longer be allowed. As often happens here in this most religious of countries, Americans have started turning to their places of worship for comfort and answers to the horrors they and the rest of the world have witnessed. America feels somehow different now. Fortress USA has been breached, leaving a nation feeling shocked, shaken, and decidedly vulnerable. Rob Watson, BBC News, Washington.
We can go live now to Washington and join another of our correspondents, Stephen Speech. Stephen, the machinery of government in the United States in effect shut down for several hours after these appalling events. Any indication now that government is back in control?
Well, in his speech, President Bush said that parts of the federal agencies here would be opening up this evening and they would be fully open for business tomorrow. Now, that's obviously not completely true because we have a large chunk of the Pentagon which is clearly not going to be open for business. But I think, unlike in New York, where it's understandable, given the scale of the destruction, that Mayor Giuliani would ask some people perhaps to stay at home, I think here in Washington, it's very important for the US government to show that it is open for business, that life goes on, if not as normal, then about as normally as it can, despite the attacks.
President Bush has vowed to find those responsible and hunt them down. Where does that search begin?
I think suspicions here among the intelligence community are turning towards the Middle East, and I think it does seem pretty clear from what at least one Republican senator was saying today that there are people in the CIA who suspect that Osama bin Laden and his group were responsible for this. It's a suspicion, of course. This may turn out to be wrong, but I think that's where thoughts are turning. As to where they go from here, it's difficult to say. It seems likely there'll be some sort of retaliation, whether there'll be something very immediate or perhaps something a little bit further into the future remains to be seen. But there are different ways people are approaching this. We've had some politicians, including President Bush, using relatively restrained language. Another senator from the Foreign Relations Committee saying the important thing is to make sure that civil liberties are maintained, not to play the terrorists' game. And then other people saying, you know, this is war, this is like Pearl Harbor, you know, law enforcement isn't enough, we have to really go to war to find these people.
And still President Bush saying that the United States would not only go after any group that was involved, but any nation that gave them shelter.
Yes, I mean, it's very hard not to see in this a reference to the way in which Osama bin Laden has been sheltered by the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's hard not to read that into it. And I think the strong implication is that, you know, whichever government lies behind this, they will be held responsible as well. Now, of course, there is some debate here about whether or not governments are responsible for this. Some experts say, no, you have terrorist groups which act more or less on their own. They have to set up their own networks. No government would want to be associated with this for fear of the retaliation. And then you have others. There's an article in the Washington Post coming out this morning which is saying, no, that's absolutely not the case. You would need to have the full backing of an intelligence service to carry out something like this, the intelligence service of a government.
Is anybody there, though, pointing anywhere other than towards the Middle East for the source of this disaster?
No, I think realistically not. I think really we've got that finger of suspicion pointing at Osama bin Laden, and then if anyone can come up with a better idea, then, you know, that's welcome. But I don't think anyone has got any other concrete ideas as to where it could have come from.
Stephen Speech in Washington, thank you very much.
After what's the worst ever attack on American soil, US policymakers are now considering how to respond. Bill Hayton looks at the options.
The wreckage at the Pentagon is still being cleared and the human cost still being counted. The horror inflicted on bases and embassies around the world over the past 2 decades has now hit America's highest military headquarters. The sheer might controlled from this building has made direct military attacks against the United States all but impossible. Instead, its enemies have turned to so-called asymmetric warfare, small-scale operations with dramatic effects, such as last year's bomb attack in Yemen against the USS Cole. Washington has responded with court action against those it believes responsible, but also with direct military retaliation.
And I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
When Osama bin Laden's group bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 3 years ago, killing more than 220 people, the response was dramatic. More than 80 cruise missiles were fired at sites in Afghanistan and Sudan, allegedly connected to his organization. They killed 20 people but missed bin Laden himself. The actual bombers were extradited to the US, and last May 4 men were convicted in New York and sentenced to life in jail. But retaliation doesn't always hit the right targets. In 1986, after 2 American soldiers were blown up in a Berlin nightclub, US planes bombed Libya, though it was later suggested that Syrian agents had been responsible. And Washington is being sued for millions of dollars by a businessman whose Sudanese factory was destroyed by a cruise missile after it was wrongly linked to bin Laden.
If they reflect on these questions and if they look at the source of the resentment in the Arab world and Muslim world, I believe there wouldn't be any attack. But sending cruise missile, it wouldn't solve the problem. It will maybe fuel more problems to the American and to the whole international community.
The USS Enterprise is sailing to join another carrier group in the Gulf, projecting American power into the heart of the Middle East. But political leaders must now decide whether using that power makes further attacks more or less likely in the future. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
Well, let's look further at some of those issues thrown up. Joining us now in the studio is Dr. Martin Navius, who's a defence and security analyst. Is it simplistic or justified to look purely at Osama bin Laden holed up in Afghanistan?
Well, the problem is that in these kind of terrorist outrages, it is very difficult to get definitive evidence usable in court that any particular terrorist group carried it out. Osama bin Laden will not state openly that he carried it out, even if he did carry it out.
We've heard quite recently that he's categorically denied any involvement.
Well, exactly. That has been his approach in the past. So the question is, is the United States going to carry on along a path of quasi-legal action, which it has done in the past, or is it going to have to take another alternative, and that is the United States may have to decide who it is going to hold responsible. It can decide that Osama bin Laden is that group that is responsible, and therefore they are going to go after him. Alternatively, they can decide that they are going to go after a wider group of terrorists along the length and breadth of the Middle East and elsewhere, and also after a range of countries that support them. If they do that, then we're looking at a long and drawn-out and bloody conflict that can go on for years.
Now, it has been pointed out, hasn't it, that the amount of orchestration and planning and the amount of finance and technical know-how to have carried out these attacks is beyond the ken of so many of these sort of shadowy groups that one might immediately suspect of being involved.
Well, the reason why a focus falls on Osama bin Laden is twofold. One, because he is believed to have carried out the first terrorist attack against the World Trade Center, and secondly, because he has the capability to carry out these sophisticated attacks. People are also saying that a terrorist organization in itself cannot do it. It would have to get the support of a government authority. If that is the argument, then I don't think we can look solely at the Afghani regime, because I don't think the Afghani regime has the capability for this kind of capability. We may have to look at other countries as well.
It's almost impossible, isn't it, to avoid asking the question or posing the point that American people have been let down by their security apparatus.
Well, that is going to be investigated. These attacks are notoriously difficult to counter. No doubt the terrorist group that carried this one out has been planning it for a long time. This was an extremely complex and difficult operation that probably had years of planning behind it. We will have to wait for the investigation, and no doubt heads will roll.
It almost beggars belief, really, that in Fortress USA, 4 planes can be almost simultaneously hijacked.
Well, everybody now knows and is quite well aware of the limitations in security related to domestic flights in the United States. No doubt this will change, but obviously it's too late.
How now does the American government go about sorting out this investigation? Where do they start? How do they start to answer the questions that are now being raised?
Well, it's going to be a very difficult operation. The United States has its intelligence sources, it has its human intelligence sources throughout the Middle East. It will deal with its allies in the region, the Israelis and others, and will seek to try and get as much information as possible. But like I said, I don't think you're ever going to get definitive proof that one group or another carried it out. What you're going to see is the United States making a decision as to how broad it wishes its operations to be. It can focus on Osama bin Laden, hold him responsible and go after him, but that will be difficult because they've tried to find him for years, and no doubt he's hiding now. Or they can say, we are going to try and deal with this problem of terrorism and therefore go after a wider group of organizations and states backing those groups.
Well, we've already heard, haven't we, that in the Middle East in particular, there are fears right now of there being a precipitous and ill-thought-out retaliation by George Bush.
Well, I mean, critics of George Bush will say whatever he does is ill thought out and precipitous. Look, how does one respond to a terrorist attack of such proportions? We have no experience of it. The United States, to be fair, has criticized Israel for escalating the crisis in the Middle East by its responses to Palestinian terrorist attacks. But I think the United States will follow a different path. I think they will escalate. The United States has to respond. It has to show its domestic population that it will react. No population in a democracy can tolerate being attacked in this way, and the United States will respond. There are many countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, many organizations that are at this moment extremely fearful. The United States, I don't think, has decided on an option, but if we use the Pearl Harbor analogy, once the United States decides, it will act ruthlessly and effectively and will deal with this terrorist threat to the best of its capability.
Once the immediate horror sinks in and the rebuilding starts in America, one thing that will last will be the continuing sense of inviolability has gone. I mean, Americans' perceptions of themselves will have been turned on its head.
More important than the impact on any domestic or foreign policy will be the impact upon perceptions, the worldview. I think Americans will be much more pessimistic about their security and about the nature of international relations following this event. There is going to be a lessening of tolerance for terrorism, for suicide bombing. It will change Americans' calculations as to who are its allies in the Middle East and elsewhere, who is going to get support. I think there will be ultimately winners and losers of these events in the Middle East and elsewhere, and no doubt as the Americans are at this very moment calculating their casualties, there are other states and other organizations in the Middle East and elsewhere calculating the costs and benefits of this tragedy in the United States for their own causes and operations.
Dr. Navias, thank you.
We'll have more reaction to the events in America in a couple of minutes. First, though, Tanya's here with the business news. And Tanya, the world of business very much affected by what's been going on in the States.
Yes, that's absolutely right. A state of shock, as you can well imagine. It's very difficult to assess at the moment what the long-term effects of this are going to be, but certainly the insurance industry obviously very much affected, people concerned about the flow of funds. And the horror that unfolded in New York and Washington shut down the stock markets in the states, and they will remain closed today. In Europe's financial districts, workers were evacuated yesterday for fear of attacks. The European stock markets open again in a few hours amid fears that the attacks on America could tip the already weak global economy into recession. And in the light of those fears, central bankers around the world have said they are ready to pump emergency funds into banking the markets to ensure that a meltdown of the financial system is avoided. In terms of the way traders have reacted, there has been a flight to Asia, Singapore, China and so on, and also to the bond markets, avoiding particularly the US dollar, and we've seen the euro move on the back of that. You can see, though, the FTSE 100 in London, the stock exchange evacuated, but trade was able to continue. Of course, it's electronic nowadays, down 287 points for the FTSE 100. The DAX off in Frankfurt, 396 at one point in intraday trade, down just about 9%. Traders bracing themselves for another turbulent day. As you can imagine, the CAC 40 off over 300 points as well. Let's move on to some of the other markets if we can and see how they've been reacting. You can see the euro there rising quite substantially against the dollar. It was below the 90 cents level. It's now well above that. Meanwhile, dollar yen at 119. Again, it's at about the 121 level. Well, I'll be back with more on those stories here on the BBC's World Business Report in 15 minutes. Martine.
Tanya, thank you. Well, President Bush has acknowledged that thousands of people were killed in the series of attacks in which hijacked airliners were flown deliberately into landmark buildings on Tuesday. Speaking from the White House, President Bush said the victims' lives had been ended by evil. He said world leaders would stand together to win the war against terrorism.
It's a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.